I think it is clear to believe in the power of ideas.
Fresh thinking of the Manhattan Institute.
Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Larry Mone, president of the Manhattan Institute. I want to thank you all for joining us today for this interesting discussion about the future of America's cities. It's my honor today to introduce our luncheon speaker, America's premier political journalist, Michael Barone. As most of you know, Michael is a resident scholar at the American Enterprise Institute, a Fox News contributor, and the senior political analyst for the Washington Examiner, where he writes a twice-weekly column. He is also the author of 4 books, as well as the principal author of the Almanac of American Politics, which has been published every 2 years since 1971. It has become a cliche to call the Almanac indispensable, but it truly is. And I know Michael is hard at work on the 21st edition, which is going to include many, many new entries, thanks to the recent midterm elections. Michael is probably best known for his encyclopedic knowledge of American politics, but in his hands, politics is a much more meaningful endeavor than the red versus blue horse race that is so often reduced to on cable news. Aristotle offered one of the first and probably still the best definitions of politics when he called it the art of free men deciding over how they ought to order their lives together. How ought we order our lives together in this big, diverse, wonderful country is, I think, the question that Michael has been trying to answer ever since he was a young boy poring over the latest census data. With his deep knowledge of American history and public policy, Michael helps to enliven our public discourse. Please join me in welcoming America's indispensable journalist, Michael Barone.
Well, thank you, Larry, for that very kind introduction. I'm inclined to think that all journalists are dispensable, but that's the, I've gone in my professional career from one profession to the other, from law to political consulting to journalism, each one of which tends to pay less than the one before, and also to have a lower level of intellectual integrity. In journalism, I miss the high intellectual rigor of political consultants. So consequently, the only thing left for me is academia. So, well, I'm not here really to talk about the election. We had a sort of weather event on the 2nd of November, a tsunami that went from the George Washington Bridge to the Donner Pass. It sort of left the cannibals standing on either end of that, and about which City Journal and the Manhattan Institute have written so much. But I'm not here to talk so much about elections in the short run, but about the battle of ideas in the long run. And I do think that, one of the things I've learned over a long period of time is that ideas have power, and that really good ideas can sometimes prevail even in the most politically unlikely circumstances and settings. And City Journal and the Manhattan Institute are in many ways a prime example of that. It's an honor here to speak here because I think that as I look back on it, it seems to me City Journal has done more to spread good ideas that have improved our society generally and our great cities in particular, more than any other single publication I can think of. And it's also a pleasure because City Journal has been a pleasure to read. It's a pleasure just to hold in your hands and look at and page through. Every one of those 80 issues over the last 20 years has been an intellectual feast and an aesthetic treat. Although, don't they come out a little late sometimes, Brian? I'm just... Okay, just checking. Many Americans today have only a dim memory of what life was like in our big cities, and particularly here in New York, as it was when City Journal was first published in 1990. I mean, this was still the New York of Bonfire of the Vanities. Today's youth would have to go to the movie or something to try and see what New York was like. The Manhattan Island was plagued with, you had to go in through the squeegee artists, you had the thieves, you had to put, no radio on your car thing, take your radio out. You had, the idea that Times Square would be a place that tourists from across America and from around the world would come to with their families was not an idea that really crossed anybody's mind in those days. I mean, my recollection, if you're in Times Square at night, you'd see a few people who sort of look like this, and you kind of say, gee, I better go on the other side of the street and so forth. Bryant Park was Needle Park in those days. And there was a sort of attitude of fatalism, and I think some of your other speakers this morning have talked about that. You had a city where you had 1 million people on welfare. 2,262 people were murdered in New York City that year. And we were told by a lot of experts, by the liberal conventional wisdom, that that's just the way things had to be, that, we were in an unjust society, and you naturally had to expect that people who were victims of the injustice would respond in ways that might perhaps be interpreted as negative, like murdering other people. And that, it's important not to be judgmental, and that that this was part of the adventure of living in a big city. That, this was, you had to be tough and hardy and not be one of those wimps that goes out to the suburbs or something like that, as you're, wondering if you can get from Park Avenue to Lexington Avenue safely. To get over to the deli or whatever it was. So that was, there was an idea that nothing else was really possible. This was just the way things had to be. And I think City Journal and the Manhattan Institute really had a different idea. This was a magazine dedicated to the proposition that cities did not need to be pools of poverty, disorder, and despair, that big cities could be, they had been, they could be, and they should be centers of excellence and achievement, centered places of order and beauty and delight. And it set out to show how this could be so. One essential step, of course, was controlling crime. Boy, I would like to go back in a time capsule to 1990 and find a bookie or somebody at off-track betting willing to take a $1,000 bet that the number of murders in New York would be cut by 80% in 20 years. Because I wouldn't have to work for a living. I'm collecting on that bet at the odds that you would have been given in those days. This was something that just nobody thought was possible, and the criminology departments of major universities, as I understand it, the opinion was there's nothing you really do to fight crime. It's just going to happen, and actually you deserve it. The best response at that time was Ed Koch's saying, "Mug him again," but that was the theory. But people reading City Journal could read about George Kelling, James Q. Wilson, about broken windows, and that a policy of intensive policing and zero tolerance for minor infractions could reduce crime enormously. And one of those readers, of course, in the early 1990s, was an unsuccessful political candidate and prosecutor named Rudy Giuliani, who, as I understand, has claimed that he plagiarized all his policies from the pages of City Journal. And I've gathered that Rudy was a regular attender of of Manhattan Institute meetings and sessions and so forth. And he rose, to be elected mayor in 1993, put many of these policies into effect, and I think is the most successful reformer of government that we have seen in the second half of the 20th century. I wrote in one of my essays about New York City that they'd had two Republican mayors in the second half of the 20th century, one of whom basically ruined the city, John Lindsay, and the other who restored it, Rudy Giuliani. And a lot of what Rudy Giuliani did and a lot of the policies he put in place were the things that were advocated and written about in City Journal. And that includes not only crime, but welfare reform, and taking a look at things that happen across the country. I mean, the inspiration for this journal, it seems to me, is primarily New York, but it's been one that has looked at cities across the country and around the world. And so you take a look at what's going on in welfare in states like Wisconsin and other states where mostly Republican, but actually some Democratic governors as well, were experimenting with different welfare, taking people off welfare and putting them in work. And of course, New York City did that and cut the welfare rolls by more than half. City Journal has also been a leading protagonist in the fight for better schools, remembering the tradition of excellence of the New York City public school system and pointing the way towards school choice, towards parental choice, towards teacher accountability, leaving room for initiatives by talented teachers and principals. It's the only thing that it hasn't advocated that I would suggest is that if we could somehow do time traveling and have the New York City school system run by the people that ran it in 1910. Once again for a year, get rid of a lot of nonsense and put in a lot of good reforms. It seems to me that that's just one example of how City Journal's advocacy of reform has been stimulated and informed by its interest in history. And it's, in this city in particular, it's a city that suffers from overgovernment, but it hasn't been a national or a state capital for a very long time, since the 1790s. It's a city that has grown. It's been a product more of entrepreneurs and merchants, people operating through free markets, producing products and providing services that central planners could never have anticipated. This month's City's Journal has some evocation of the how New York became a center for the sugar industry. This is not a place where you can actually grow much sugar cane or even beet sugar. But New York became the center of that because entrepreneurs recognized an opportunity to provide a product and to do so at a competitive price and to distribute it and win the battle for competition. It's been a merchant city since colonial times, the nation's dominant financial center from the mid-19th century, and a manufacturing center for much of the 20th century. It's been a driver for economic growth, and it has once again with the finance industry, although as Nicole was saying, there's some dangers in over-reliance on finance. Nonetheless, it has that history of sort of generating the unanticipatable products of the marketplace. And in the process, New York has generated great civic and cultural institutions. That, as City Journal has pointed out in many articles, the tradition of philanthropy did not wait for the institution of the federal estate tax to be applied here in New York. It's been pretty active for more than 100 years. And New Yorkers have built these great civic institutions that are the equal of any in the world. We have others in other cities in the United States that are also worthy of respectful attention. But what it teaches us, I think, is that commerce is not the enemy of culture. Commerce is the friend of culture. Commerce provides the capital, provides the wherewithal with which culture can survive and thrive. I think we have, in many self-proclaimed artists and intellectuals, a feeling that, the marketplace and commerce are evil and the enemies of culture. It seems to me that it's just the other way around. And in New York, in this new Amsterdam, just as in the Amsterdam of the 17th century, you can see the equivalent of what you see in Simon Schama's The Embarrassment of Riches, these kind of uncouth merchants that have got ties all over the world, They get up early, they stay up late, they work hard, they party hard. They're kind of vulgar. Old money is when you've had it for about 15 minutes. And they're also supporting the greatest art and culture in the world, all at the same time. And that old Amsterdam of the 17th century, it seems to me, had a spirit that's very akin to the spirit of this new Amsterdam, New York of the 19th and 20th and now the 21st century. And I think City Journal has helped me to appreciate that much more than I would have, and I think has helped many others to do so. Now, it's also showed how this engine of growth can be and has been slowed down by excessive government, bloated bureaucracy, ridiculous regulation, and sky-high taxes. But it has also shown how New York grew and can grow again. I remember reading in City Journal some time ago, I'm sure I could locate the citation, that in the old days before rent control, when supposedly free markets could never provide housing, that reasonably well-off families would rent an apartment for 10 months, then they'd rent a summer place for 2 months, and they'd come back to the city and rent an apartment. There'd be plenty of them. The marketplace was providing before Mitchell-Lama, before the Public Housing Acts and so forth, and before Robert Moses. This system worked. It can work again. It gives me some insight, little practical examples like that, glimpses of life in the past, I think are very illuminating and helpful to those of us who are trying to understand better what the potential for the future can be. And as I said, you also go out, City Journal also looks at a lot of American and foreign cities. The autumn 2010 issue sort of surpasses itself in this regard. It seems to me you've gone to Newark and my hometown of Detroit, where the newest urban application is we're going to have a lot of farming, pheasant hunting. It's the highest and best use of the land, actually, and so forth. It helps locavores have, eat local foods and things. You looked at street people, the sweet street people of Love Inn in San Francisco, through Heather McDonald, New Orleans with Nicole Gelinas, and how it's fascinating to me. New Orleans has, she's describing how New Orleans is rebuilding and in a much better way with more, with the nation's largest percentage of charter schools, a lot more responsive government, learning from a disaster, profiting somehow from recovering, and the chance to start over again. And I was thinking as I was preparing this that New Orleans and New York have something in common, which I hadn't thought about before. Ethnic heritage. Most of America, as David Hackett Fisher teaches in his book, Albion Seed, was settled by and is still influenced by the folkways, the cultures of four different parts of the British Isles. And New York and New Orleans are exceptions. New York is Dutch and New Orleans is French. These were the two great ports of the antebellum America. They come out of that different tradition. I guess what we've learned is that the Dutch example really does do better over time. The French example produces pleasures and aesthetic delights that are difficult to imitate otherwise, but it can use a good dose of Americanization, which it seems to be getting today. And we go on to Fremont, California, Seoul, Korea, Tel Aviv, et cetera, all in one volume of City Journal. It seems to me that as I've read City Journal over the years, this is a publication that holds that civilization reaches its highest levels in central cities, and that central cities thrive best when principles generally considered conservative principles, like, as I wrote once about the Manhattan Institute, that markets work, morals matter, where those principles are respected. And yet, we've got the paradox that central cities, in terms of our standard political nomenclature, are the least central conservative part of the country. And we can see this in the election returns in the most recent election, where by and large New York, California, and Illinois, the states with our three largest metropolitan areas are the one states where the Democratic Party had substantial success, as well as the state of Nevada for Senator Harry Reid, which I guess shows that high intellect and persistence and intellectual consistency can somehow pay off in a gambling environment. But I think that's partly because, when you look at the actual groups of people that vote in central cities, Black Americans, for historic reasons, have a high commitment to the Democratic Party. Hispanics and other immigrants tend to vote Democratic, though not by nearly as much a margin, and it varies from state to state, community to community. And the other voting bloc that's really important is the group that my friend Joel Kotkin, who's been in City Journal, calls gentry liberals. You're basically talking about people with high levels of education. If you look at how people with graduate school degrees vote, they vote hugely Democratic. They're the most Democratic education group in New York. This is, of course, an argument for the abolition of graduate schools. And perhaps with respect to the faculty's capital punishment, but nonetheless, them are the facts. Professionals, a very high mixture of incomes. These are people who are voting mostly on cultural issues and things like abortion rights, gay rights, opposition to American military action, sort of opposition to senses of American exceptionalism. There was a book a few years ago by a liberal writer called What's the Matter with Kansas, in which he argued that voters in his native Kansas were irrational because they were not voting their economic interest to have the government shove more of other people's money onto them, but were rather voting on cultural issues. And I was thinking about writing a book called What's the Matter with the Upper East Side? Because they're doing the same thing, and this liberal writer doesn't refuse their votes, I don't think these people are going to vote Republican anytime soon. But I do think that Manhattan Institute and City Journal have had an important effect on the thinking of gentry liberals. I mean, we as I said to my Republican friends 2 years ago and to my Democratic friends this year, none of us wants to live in a country where one party wins all the elections. And so one of the prices of that is that sometimes your party loses. And we just sort of have to put up with that. And one party is not going to win all the elections. But ideas can have continuing power, whoever is winning elections. And it seems to me that as I survey the landscape and try to understand the points of view of various people, I think that many of the lessons that City Journal has been teaching have been learned and have been internalized by a lot of the gentry liberals in our city. You don't see many of them advocating a return to the police policies of Mayor David Dinkins and longing for nostalgia for those days. They have, we are beginning to see rifts between the gentry liberals and public employee unions. Think of School Commissioner Joel Klein of New York City, who's just leaving that job. I was at an American Enterprise panel featuring Governor Mitch Daniels of Indiana, Governor Jeb Bush of Florida, and Joel Klein. And Jeb Bush and Mitch Daniels were denouncing the teachers' unions and saying how they were opposed to them. But the guy that really had, smoke coming out of his nose and fire and brimstone for the teachers' unions was Joel Klein, the Democrat. He was just steaming up. And I thought to myself, if Jeb Bush and Mitch Daniels were for capital punishment for teacher union leaders, then, in this unlikely case, then Joel Klein would agree with them, but he would torture them first. And, we saw this in Washington, D.C., my home city, where the Mayor Adrian Fenty appointed a school reformer chancellor, Michelle Rhee. They were opposed by the teachers' unions, and basically gentry liberals, which are a rising demographic and will soon be a majority of the district, voted for Adrian Fenty, and most black voters voted for his opponent, and the opponent won. So, but that's going to be continuing fights that are going on. And I think, you know, the values, the lessons that City Journal has been teaching really have been internalized. A lot of these people won't admit it. But I think you've even affected some of the editorial writers on the New York Times from time to time. Don't tell Joyce Pernick I said this, but that's, I think that has really been a fact. In fact, these people probably don't like to be reminded of it. Just as no good deed goes unpunished, no great favor goes unresented. But the fact is you've helped to build a better city, helped politicians to do so, and I think you've had an effect on people's thinking on public policies that is more than ephemeral and that will persist for a long time. Finally, I just want to say something about the look and feel of City Journal. I've been fascinated with this at the beginning. It's printed on heavier paper and more glossier paper than most things. That's a kind of Manhattan thing, isn't it? And the use of graphics and photographs, and some of these old photographs, is something that I just love. And it's made me look at cities, look at New York in particular when I'm here differently, and to appreciate some of the things that go on. And I think one of the lessons is, you know, you do the details of these old buildings that were built 50 and 100 years ago, and you begin to realize these are part of the creativity of the city. This is part of the beauty that we are lucky enough to live with, and the heritage that we should be trying to preserve and respect even as we build new things and indulge in new styles and new efforts and so forth. These classic things. I'm not a very visual person, so I have to be kicked and trained by City Journal to look around me and to see the surroundings that I pass through more clearly. But I just want to thank you finally for presenting, for publishing and persisting in a journal which sets a high aesthetic standard and has helped me certainly, and I suspect many other readers as well, to appreciate better the cities around us. Thanks very much.
Thank you very much for those incredibly kind words. We have plenty of time for some questions, and they can veer off, maybe even talk about the election. Right here.
Okay.
Thank you so much, Michael. That's a wonderful talk. The Manhattan Institute has sort of claimed as its patron saint Alexander Hamilton, who was an urbanist, but America grew out of Jeffersonian vision as well, which is the celebration of agrarian values, and which has a very long tradition of resentment and fear of cities as dens of iniquity. Would you just trace historically the tension between those two visions of where human beings best thrive, whether it's in the countryside, away from the vice of cities, or cities themselves within American history?
Now, that sounds like my next book. Well, actually, I've been working on a book on American migrations. I'm internal and immigrant, and I'm sort of behind on this, but it's, it almost strikes me New York is a city that's kind of opportunistically taken advantage of both impulses. I mean, this was a city that, you know, it avoided mostly the moralism of the New England Yankee diaspora that went around preaching temperance, which New York never fully adopted, and abolition of slavery. New York was doing a great business with the cotton traders in the South, and of course many Wall Street firms actually got their start as cotton traders in the South, including many of the German Jewish firms, and so forth. So New York sort of was participating, was the city that was catering to the ag. And, you know, how did New York become a financial center? Well, Andrew Jackson, who was voted for by the city mobs in New York and engineered by upstate New York's Martin Van Buren, closed the second bank of the United States, which was based in Philadelphia. And so exit Philadelphia as the nation's leading finance center and enter New York. It's part of a political deal. This is a cynical take on it, but, you know, it's, we've become an urban country. Officially, the 1920 census was taken as the boundary and we became an urban country because by census definition, any place with a population of 2,500 was urban. Of course, that could be in one city block in New York, In 1910, New York, Manhattan Island had 2.3 million people as opposed to 1.5 million today, and half of them lived south of 14th Street. So you had crowding like crazy. But the 1920, and the Congress refused to reapportion the House seats among the different states, as the Constitution commands. They said it's really not fair because we would take away representation from rural areas which are virtuous and give it to the cities which are vicious and alien. And it was the same period that we get prohibition and immigration restriction legislation. So, there was a sort of reaction there, but I don't know, there's a kind of an interplay there. Herbert Hoover solved the problem of reapportionment by persuading Congress in 1929 or 30 to pass a statute setting up a automatic statistical method for reapportioning the districts. So you just plug in the census numbers into a formula and you get the districts, which will happen next month. But, City Journal, it seems to me, stands for the proposition that the cities really are more civilizing. And while we certainly had Thomas Jefferson having a great library out in Albemarle County, Virginia, it's kind of the gathering and cross-germination of people and the creation of great cultural institutions that make, a big difference. And, when you think of New York, you think of an area that's been supportive of public policies, of big government policies, but some of your big culture, the New York Public Library, the Queens Library are private institutions, started even before Andrew Carnegie, I think. So, that trend has been lively, and I think City Journal has helped me appreciate this more than I did before.
Harvey? Stanley Goldstein, I enjoyed those remarks, especially the feel and the look of City Journal. You're absolutely right. They are big additions to the quality of the publication. But you talked about public service unions and how most people realize they've gone too far, even the gentry. But they're permanent. They have the advantage. Year in and year out, they spend money on campaigns, they build capital. What would it take to have a permanent organization for fiscal responsibility in cities and the federal government that will be there not just for this election or next election, but for 50 or 100 years?
What you're talking about? What would we need for an institutional thing? Well, I think that the public employee unions could be defunded if the right set of laws were placed and the right set of actions were taken. It's not inevitable that they have the right to strike. Federal government has public employee unions, but they don't ever strike. Ronald Reagan reiterated that policy, but presidents of both parties have insisted on it. You can have that kind of polity. You can have a situation where you don't have many public employee unions like Texas. The reapportionment of the House districts among the states, which reflects relative population growth, is projected that Texas will gain 4 seats and New York lose 1 or 2. That's a comment on, among other things, the public policies of New York State and the state of Texas over the last 10 years and longer. So I don't think this battle is hopeless. I think one of the things that we may see in the next couple years come to a head is something that Steve Malanga's been writing about in City Journal a lot, which is the public finances of states like California, Illinois, and New York, all of which have Democratic governors, Democratic legislatures, except maybe the New York State Senate, where the state Senate Republicans are owned by a different group of public employee unions from the people that own the state Senate Democrats, as I understand it. But that these face a real possibility of being cut off by private markets. Nobody's going to lend money to them. And, say hello to Greece. And also, the new Congress's attitude towards bailing out those state governments will not be one of unlimited generosity. It will be, as Jean-Francois Carey might say, au contraire.
Over here.
Just seeing the last election, especially in my area, Queens, where we lost a longtime state senator, Frank Padovan, who was in office for 40 years, Republican. Where do you see the vision, or where would you see the next wave of voters, the next Reagan Democrats, where reformers could count on to try to bring in these reforms to action?
Well, I think in New York City, it's, the numbers look pretty difficult if you're looking for a renaissance of the Republican Party. We did see a Republican congressman elected to replace a Democrat in the district that includes Staten Island, but that's, that's the one part of America where I can never find a New York Times. I think that's kind of disturbing. I mean, one of the things that's going on is, in parts of Metro New York, and you go out to Nassau County and you see a lot of the same kind of thing, is, you've got new immigrant people, you've got a lot of people who are public employee union members or feel connected to them, and you've had exodus of the people that don't like this kind of thing. I mean, a friend of mine in Connecticut once wrote, well, where the Republicans did not gain a single congressional seat, Democrats hold all 5 of them. He said, well, the people who used to vote Republican in Connecticut 4 and 5 are now in Florida 4 and 5. I think in Metro New York, partisan Republican point of view, it's kind of scary. Upstate, the Republicans did make some gains in the House seats. Now, they were down to 2 House seats, in a state where, in the 1950s, they held about 34. Now the whole state doesn't have 34 congressmen, but, the upstate, but I haven't examined those numbers to look around, but I think, this group is really more involved in propagating ideas with a view to trying to affect public policy regardless of partisan things. And if you see a collapse of state government finances, we'll see what happens. I mean, as I understand, Andrew Cuomo, the Democratic governor-elect in this state, Jerry Brown, the Democratic former governor and now governor-elect, who was governor when he was too young and is now going to be governor when he's too old, have both sort of given out hints, at least, that they see some need to cabin in public spending, and they've tried to hint that they'd be a kind of Nixon goes to China with the public employee unions. I expect the City Journal and other Manhattan Institute publications to hold some feet to the fire there.
Right here? Yes, just wait for the microphone, please. Yes.
Well, I'm on the Upper West Side, which is a fairly depressing place to be politically. Well, my congressman is Jerry Nadler, okay?
He's a large figure in Washington.
Yes, although not as large as he was before he had
Right.
surgery.
Yes.
But it seems, I find it very depressing to even consider going over to vote, because nobody is trying in my area. And I think that the Upper West Side and other parts of Manhattan are maybe too easily dismissed by people who have a historic memory. Because I'll tell you, during the national elections, when I wore a Reagan button or a McCain button, people came up to me, I think particularly of a lady in Zabar's, more than one. They would come up to me and they would whisper, "You're very brave," or even, "Thank God for what you're doing." And I'd say, do you want a button? I've got a couple of extras in my pocket. And they say, no, I don't dare. And there is a potential here that nobody is looking at. I find it hysterical that I am considered a paragon of courage because I put on a Republican button just to annoy people.
Well, I think it's, some guy in 1992 when George H.W. Bush was losing in Washington printed up some signs that said, "Annoy the media, vote for Bush." We'll see. I don't know. I had a similar experience once visiting friends in Park Avenue, and a woman in the elevator recognized me from Fox News, and she said, "We're the only Republicans in this building." But your point is, there may have been others they didn't know about. Yeah, well, I think that's some, you know, maybe next time they should try.
Michael Myers. This morning we talked about the corrosive and corrupting influence of governmental funding towards certain groups in the urban areas. I want to ask your comment about the corrosive and corrupting influences of money from private sources, such as in New York City, we're led by the richest man in the state of New York. So you have a combination of private philanthropy as well as public, a person who controls the public purse, and in that way can control and influence the players that used to be called the bonfire of the vanities. In other words, keep them at bay. And so my question is to you, in the absence of an institutionalized process of reform, when Mayor Bloomberg is out after 3 years and there's no heir apparent, Republican or other, who looks like him or who will act like him, how long before it will go back to the bonfire of the vanity constituencies fighting for the public purse and fighting for advantages over private philanthropy?
I think that's an excellent question, and I don't really have the answer. I mean, you know, Mayor Bloomberg came fairly close to being defeated this last election, and you know, it suggests that the balance is moving in the other direction. As you point out, there don't seem to be any candidates that can do anything like what he has done, or much less what Rudy Giuliani did as mayor. I doubt that Rudy's interested in going back to that at this stage in his life. So, you know, I think that's a real problem that a lot of people in this room are facing, and, you know, if you've got a house in Palm Beach County, you may want to move there, but no, I mean, it's a serious threat to New York, and, you know, I like to believe that learning is cumulative, that the lessons that City Journal has been teaching have in many ways been internalized within a large block of people in this city who are open to ideas, but it may not be enough to have political things, and sometimes each generation has to learn the lesson again, that, you know, you had a terrible period under Mayor Lindsay here in the city when crime and welfare dependency tripled roughly within a period of 10 years, or even more. You know, New York led the nation in that trend. You had some recovery with Mayor Koch, receding with unfortunate Mayor Dinkins, and then huge public policy changes and changes in the way of life here. So, you know, that's something to fight for. I think one of the good ideas of having an anniversary like this is just to remind us all of what this place was like 20 years ago, what you were up against. It didn't seem when you were starting this endeavor 20 years ago that it was clear you were going to win as much as you ended up winning. So that's some reason for optimism, but, you know, I don't see as many other reasons for optimism as I do. In the politics business, everybody's always asked me, who are the Republicans going to run in 2012? Who's the next Ronald Reagan? Well, the answer is, you know, you don't always get Ronald Reagans, and I don't know who the Republican nominee is going to be. And you can't always rely on it's nice to get a politician who really does a lot of things that you think need to be done and does them very effectively, like Rudy did. But those are maybe unusual in history. We have to work hard on other fronts, and perhaps even on the Upper West Side.
All right, we have time for maybe 2 more questions over here, since you haven't asked a question.
What do you think is how would you evaluate Ed Koch, his importance on turning around the city of New York, especially compared to Giuliani?
Well, you know, sort of like Ed Koch, I was trying to explain Ed Koch to my parents in Michigan a while ago. and they had this image of Ed Koch as kind of a short Jewish man. I had to explain that Ed Koch is actually quite a tall Jewish man. And, you can win bets on who is taller, Mario Cuomo or Ed Koch. They were all betting on Cuomo. Nope. It seemed to me, Ed, as somebody who doesn't live here, after all, that Ed Koch, on balance, did a lot of very good things for New York City, and that there was some real recovery of civic virtue and creativity during his years as mayor, and that he was sort of the tribune of the kind of outer borough homeowner, if you will, the homeowner that seems to be a weaker force in what was Frank Padavan's district and various parts of Queens, and that political strategists are going to have to figure out and think about how you go about working with an electorate that is somewhat different demographically, and where you don't have, those outer borough homeowners are not the kind of people who in 1977 were rebelling against John Lindsay and so forth. That's a much smaller demographic as a percentage of New York's vote now. So you got to figure out, the political strategists have to work out the new demographic. But, my gosh, Koch is still hanging in there. He came out against Congressman Morris Hinchy, who is kind of, he's sort of on the branch of the Democratic Party that Hubert Humphrey was working against in the 1948 struggle in the Democratic Farmer Labor Party of Minnesota. Let's just, which was, Humphrey was the anti-communist, as historically minded people will remember. Anyway.
Last question, Howard.
Michael, we heard a lot this morning from Steve Malanga and others about the problems visited on cities by Washington, starting with the war on poverty, the inculcation to dependency. We have a new crop of politicians in Washington that you followed closely. What do you think their attitudes are towards cities?
What are their attitudes towards cities? That's, if they just look at the electoral map, they'll see cities as enemy turf. I think a lot of, the freshmen, the new people, they're not totally all new to government, by the way. Some are new to politics. Others have been in local politics and so forth. May fail to appreciate the steps forward that have been taken in New York and in other cities, and things that you've been writing about at City Journal. You might want to send them complimentary subscriptions, just in case. I mean, it's visually distinctive enough. You kind of pick it up and say, "Oh, this is looks kind of interesting." But I don't think they've given a lot of thought. I think that they think most federal programs sending money to cities are probably a waste of money, and they'd like to cut them down. I think they think that the cities, in some ways, are sinkholes of Medicaid spending. I mean, New York City, where your program was put together by Nelson Rockefeller, who spent the taxpayers' money as if it was his own, and hugely expensive. So they're going to be looking for savings there. I don't think there's a lot of orientation, City Journal orientation, as I would put it. In some ways, the cities have become less of a problem than they were 20 years ago. We're not getting as many murders. We're not getting as much welfare dependency. To the extent those trouble people outside cities, those problems are less important. And these guys didn't get elected on solving crime and welfare, because as far as most voters are concerned, they're mostly solved. Other things are the bigger problems. So some of these issues may come up if we face a financial crisis, if we, face what Greece was facing last spring, Ireland is facing now. Does Illinois come next? And I gather their debt is rated below Ireland's, and so forth. That we may see some attitudes, and maybe the Daily News will revive its headline: Ford to City, drop dead. But I don't think they're as perhaps as hostile to cities as they were 20 years ago, just because cities are not seen as welfare crime havens as much as they used to be. You know, people who take their families to Disney World also take their families to Times Square these days, and that includes the constituents of a lot of these people. Sometimes when I'm over at something at Fox News or something, I stay in one of those Times Square hotels, and between the Irish accents and the people from the Midwest and the Deep South and everything, it's a thing I suspect most of you probably don't go over that part of town at all unless you have an office there. But it's an interesting crowd to just kind of view at night. And it's family entertainment. So I think in that sense, maybe there is some appreciation out there for what cities are, and that cities, and New York City in particular, are once again a place you take your family for a vacation. It sure wasn't an idea that was very hot 20 years ago. So let me conclude with that. Thanks very much.
Thanks very much, Michael.
I think it is clear how fortunate we are to believe in the power of ideas.
Supply the common sense and the fresh thinking of the Manhattan Institute.